Hello again. The lengths to which our Prime Minister, together with a former Prime Minister and a former Chancellor of the Exchequer, will go to avoid answering questions about what they have been up to financially is simply extraordinary. Boris Johnson, it seems, borrowed almost £1 million from somebody with the loan guaranteed by some bloke he then recommended to be appointed as chair of the BBC. When too many questions began to ask about this, he beetled off to Ukraine and started trying to widen the war there and see if he can get this country mixed up in it and perhaps declaring war on Russia. This is not an exaggeration, by the way, ridiculous as it might sound. He is urging for Ukraine to be admitted at once to NATO. If Ukraine did this, and Russia then launched a missile at Kiev, then under Article 5 of the Washington Treaty, which established NATO, the attack would have to be treated by Britain as an attack on its own territory, and we would be obliged to respond to Russia on those terms. In other words, if Ukraine joined NATO tomorrow morning, then by lunchtime this country would be at war with Russia. This does seem to be what Boris Johnson wants. For he said, talking of tanks in Britain, Germany and America, where does the Western world need to station those tanks at the moment? Guarding the North Rhine-Westphalia, protecting Tennessee, prowling the villages of Wiltshire? Let me pose the question, what conceivable grounds can there be for delay? Why are we not giving the Ukrainians all the help they need now when they need it? Well, speaking from a purely personal perspective, I would much rather have our tanks rolling around on Salisbury Plain than deployed against the Russians in Donetsk. One can understand why Boris Johnson would prefer a Third World War to start rather than having to answer questions about what looks like some slippery financial affairs which affect our national broadcaster. But the rumour is that he went off to Ukraine and is now shooting his mouth off with the blessing of Prime Minister Rishi Sunak. Sunak has his own difficulties when it comes to his finances. As I expect many of you know, Rishi Sunak is by way of being a billionaire, and his wife is even richer. She is estimated to be worth more than the king. Last summer, 6 months ago in fact, Sunak promised to publish his tax returns so that we could all see that his affairs were open and above board. In the description to this video, I give a link to a newspaper article from last November in which he repeats his promise and says that he hopes to make the information public by Christmas. Well, Christmas was a month ago and there's still no sign of the Prime Minister publishing his tax returns. His wife was until recently non-domiciled in the United Kingdom for tax purposes, which was saving her £20 million a year in tax. We are told that this arrangement has now ended, but we don't really know what's going on or whether Sunak himself benefited from his wife's status. With pressure building on both Sunak and Nadhim Zaharwi, I think that getting further mixed up in somebody else's war would be a brilliant way of distracting people's attention and giving them something else to worry about rather than thinking about tax returns from a year or two back. Of course, the Prime Minister is also desperately anxious that we stop asking any more questions about the former Chancellor of the Exchequer, who is now chair of the Conservative Party. Another man who promised to publish his tax returns last year and hasn't quite got round to it yet. Nadhim Zaharwi has the misfortune to look like the criminal mastermind from a James Bond film, which is not, of course, his fault, and does not necessarily mean that he is a dishonest man. He is, by his own admission, though, a careless one, at least as far as money is concerned. When I'm careless with money, it usually means that I've lost some or squandered it on something I don't really need. In other words, being careless with money for me means finding I have less of the stuff than I thought I had. For wealthy people like Zaharwi, though, his carelessness means that he suddenly finds he has £20 million more than he thought he had, and then he carelessly forgets to pay tax on it. Maybe that's how people get to be very rich. For all these reasons, I think that Boris Johnson very probably went to Ukraine with the Prime Minister's blessing and was privately encouraged to get us embroiled in a war there if he can manage it. Certainly, suggesting that we should send tanks to eastern Ukraine and that the country should at once be admitted to NATO sounds very much as though these people who have got themselves into various financial pickles think that a war with Russia would serve as a perfect deus ex machina to extract them from all the trouble that is now swirling around them.